Welcome back everyone for our last but not least research session for the day. I'm sure everyone is keen to hear whether accounting standards are understandable. So for this research, it's conducted by the research team, including Associate Professor Brian, um, Associate Professor Brian Hovison and Janice Luftus, and also Dr. Sabine Schur from the University of Adelaide. Just before we start, I would like to mention that all the slides for today's session will be uploaded to the WSB website shortly after the research forum. So without further ado, I will hand over the mic to Brian. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Al, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're well and enjoying the day. It's been a great day. I noted Tom Scott's earlier comment that he'd found this an exciting thing to be involved in. Just made me reflect. This is my 30th year, I think, of engagement with the AASB or its predecessor, and I've loved every minute of it. Not sure whether they feel likewise, but we'll see. Next click, please, Kathleen. So I should begin by just acknowledging that I'm presenting on from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. And the research team would certainly like to take this opportunity to very much thank the interviewees who participated in our study. They gave up their very valuable time and we appreciate it. We also had great support from the team at AASB, our academic panel, and we thank AFANS for the financial support it gave to the project. Next click, please, Kathleen. So this was our task, to investigate whether the way in which accounting standards are written and presented, I guess formatted and laid out, whether those factors impact on the ability of the users of those standards to comprehend the standard's meaning and requirements. And just highlight here that, of course, our focus is on accounting standards, as you've gathered from the title, not on whether or not financial statements are understandable. There's a considerable body of literature in that field already. Next click, please. So in terms of our motivation for this project, well, obviously the AASB asked for the project, but in more broad terms, from time to time, there's been interest in the media or complaints via the media about the complexity of accounting standards. So you can see here the Fin Review ran a story last year that CFOs felt that standards were now too complex. Something must have happened overnight because the headline the next day was standards were now outrageously complex. So better to be outraged than not, I suspect. More seriously, perhaps, certainly professional associations, for example, here we see ACCA and the AICD, have from time to time raised concerns partly about the volume and nature of increased disclosures that are in standards, or about the highly technical language that's used that makes them very inaccessible to most people. Next slide, please. Standard setters too have also shown they have an interest in this topic. Many of you will know that the IASB has a disclosure initiative project that it's been working on for a little while now, that's designed to deal with at least in part with the concerns about the level and nature of disclosures. But the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board recently started a new project, CASP, and you can see that the objective of that project was to develop drafting principles and guidelines to enable the writing of standards that result in the consistent and effective application of international auditing standards. I'd have to say, however, with a title like complexity, understandability, scalability, proportionality, they probably haven't quite started off on the right foot. Next slide, please. It's important, I think, just to, before we get into the details, just to say a couple of quick things about what we might mean by understandability. In this context, with accounting standards, we're looking at the ability of people to comprehend and consistently interpret the meaning and requirements of accounting standards. Next click, please. But I think it's also really important to understand that, if you'll pardon the pun, that understandability is really multidimensional. So as Farrell and others have pointed out, whether people can understand accounting standards will be affected by things that are both internal to themselves and external to themselves. So for example, someone's intellectual abilities or level of education or type of education, whether they share common knowledge with the author. And external might include things like font, but also, of course, the nature of the language that's used. Is it conversational in style, legalistic, or as we're sometimes accused of being, too academic? So trying to get a handle on understandability is quite problematic. And I think this range of factors that influence people's ability to understand standards came out in our interviews, as I'll try and show a little bit later. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier there's been a lot of research on understandability of financial statements. There's been relatively little that we could find on the understandability of accounting standards. Haswell, back in 2006, did an analysis of IASB and FASB standards to see whether or not the move to principles-based standards had reduced the complexity. But as you can see from this summary of his concerns, things certainly didn't seem to be getting better. Standards were argued, for example, to have muddled definitions, be overly complex and poorly defined, excessively long. Next slide, please. In terms of more empirical work, perhaps, the prior research that we could find doesn't so much measure understandability directly, but tries to measure the readability of accounting standards and other similar documents. Here, the focus is on the structural complexity of the text. So, for example, the length of sentences, the number of words used, and so forth. You can see most of this prior research has been in the US space. But the general finding of all of them, and they've used different measures of readability, but the overall finding generally is that when it comes to accounting standards, they're very difficult to read, and you may not be too surprised by that. The level of difficulty is very high, and some studies have argued that that is an impediment to people's ability to understand those standards. Next slide, please. So our approach in this project had two phases to it. Given that prior literature, we thought it was probably important to redo a readability study on a more up-to-date collection of accounting standards, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But we do have a number of concerns about how much you can really take out of those sort of readability measures. The second phase of our project was to conduct interviews with financial statement preparers and auditors, and I'll come to that in due course. Next slide, please. So in terms of measuring readability, I mentioned earlier, of course, that there are various readability measures that exist. They're essentially looking at the structure of the text, how complicated the structure of the text is. And today we're just going to report on one of these measures, the Flesch Reading Ease score, simply because it was used in the prior research and is one of the most established measures. This score is derived from a formula based on the average length of sentences and the average number of syllables in a word. And the table on the right of the screen there is just to help you interpret the scores I'm going to show you in a moment. The Flesch Reading Ease score moves from 0 to 100. The lower the score, the more difficult the text is to read. So for example, comics rate at about 92, very easy to read, whereas the Wall Street Journal ranks at a score of 43 and is therefore difficult to read. Next click, please. We applied this Flesch reading measure to 65 Australian accounting standards as compiled at the 1st of January 2020. Next click. When we did that, the readability score ranged across those 65 standards from 3 to 43, with an average score, readability score of 27 in the very difficult range. With a score like that, Flesch tells us that the readability of these standards would be equivalent, or would need someone who was a university graduate. Now, in the table I'm about to show you, I'm going to just simply quickly list the 5 most difficult standards to read and the 5 which were the easiest to read according to the Flesch score. But I thought it might be interesting. Oh, you've given it away. Never mind. I was going to say it might be interesting for you to guess which is the most difficult standard to read. Well, it's 1048, Interpretation of Standards. The irony of that is not lost, I'm sure, on the audience. So the most difficult standard in the Australian suite we looked at was 1048 with a score of 3. Kathleen, the next click, please. Here's the rest of the standards or sample of standards to show you. The ones in orange there are the 5 most difficult, and the ones in green are the 5 least difficult to read in terms of their sentence and word structure. And as I'll comment on in a minute, you might see that some of these seem a bit counterintuitive. Either way, I don't know that it matters too much because they're all either within the very difficult or difficult range. Next click, Kathleen. Just for those of you who prefer a picture, concentrate please here on the readability score in the middle. All the red dots represent all of the 65 standards. You see they're all clustered around the difficult or very difficult measure or rating. Thanks, Kathleen. So I think it's important to take away that although these readability scores are very popular in the literature or have been popular in the literature, they're not necessarily capturing understandability, I think. There are some counterintuitive rankings there. I'm sure many of you would have thought that 139 or 133 would have been particularly difficult standards to understand, and that would be consistent with the comments of our interviewees. But in terms of their sentence structure and textual structure, they were relatively well ranked. So I think there's only, I think the general message is that the standards are difficult to read, but we probably don't want to read too much more into it than that. So that brings us to our interview process. And the next slide, please, Kathleen. Here's an overview of the interviews that we conducted. We did 25 in all. You can see we had a range of financial statement preparers, auditors, and others. We had both, well, we had for-profit, private, not-for-profit, and public sector in terms of preparers. In terms of auditors, we had Big Four and non-Big Four and public sector auditors. And then we had other constituents, for example, small practitioners who were providing consulting advice to smaller not-for-profits, for example, or local governments. And we even had 2 people who had long experience in the drafting of standards. So we've got a fair range there, I think. Next slide, please. The first thing we actually asked these interviewees was, who is the audience for accounting standards? Who are they written for? And we did that because we think it might provide some insights into where the standards should be pitched, I guess, in terms of the type of language that they use. Now, it won't surprise you, of course, that without exception, financial statement preparers and auditors were seen as the primary audience for accounting standards. Next click, please. Directors and analysts were people who our interviewees felt should know something about standards, but the view was they typically don't. Directors and analysts were viewed to be primarily interested in what difference a new standard would make, for example, rather than the technical content of that standard. How would a standard, or what were the implications of a standard for the type of story that was going to be told about financial position and performance, for example, in the financial statements? Next click. There are several general observations that I think came out of our interviews. There was general agreement that accounting standards were becoming increasingly complex and harder to understand. The common examples of difficult standards won't surprise you, I suspect. AASB 9, 15, 16, 17 and 1058. These were all standards that were commonly identified as creating challenges for understanding for preparers and auditors. And of course, a number of these standards are very recent, and probably for that reason, if nothing else, clearly in the minds of preparers and auditors at this stage. Next slide, please. The interviewees argued that the older standards, such as inventory or property, plant and equipment, these were easier to understand than the newer standards, but pretty much everyone recognised this was because older standards tended to deal with simpler transactions, and more recent standards were trying to deal with much more complex contracting and transactions. Next click, please. Common reasons that were given for this perception of increased complexity were typically that the standards were becoming far too long. It was becoming overwhelming to try and work one's way, to find the time to work one's way through the voluminous material. Some were concerned that although the standards were supposed to be principles-based, there was rather too much rules-based detail within them. And in some cases, because the IASB is trying to write standards across a variety of jurisdictions, sometimes the language or the requirements didn't quite fit the institutional arrangements as they existed in a particular jurisdiction, such as Australia. And AASB 17 on insurance was singled out for this as an example. Next slide, please. We discovered pretty quickly, and again, this may not surprise you, but we discovered pretty quickly that as far as most of the interviewees were concerned, when it comes to a good or deep understanding of accounting standards, this really only existed with a very small, select and highly skilled group. Typically the technical experts in the Big Four or mid-tier audit firms, or in the public sector, this might be in the technical staff in Treasury and Finance, or with auditors in the Auditor General's departments. Next click. The role of these people was to interpret how the standards or the requirements of the standards, how they should be applied in particular contexts that each of the preparers, for example, or auditors was dealing with. So these select experts really played a role in allowing people to understand how a standard would apply in their own particular circumstances. Next slide, please. So, for example, CFOs found that they were typically having to explain standards to directors and analysts. We heard some comments about that earlier today. It was perceived that many users of standards had only a working understanding, not a deep understanding. And of course, some of the topics that are being covered by standards, such as insurance, are highly specialised. And so for many people, there was little exposure to what those standards might be, and hence little understanding of them. One of the factors that was really stressed to us was the impact of resourcing, especially amongst small organisations and small practitioners who felt they were simply time poor, had no in-house technical expertise or insufficient in-house technical expertise, and simply couldn't keep on top of the size of the standards that they were trying to deal with. They were just too long for them to have time to work through. This, of course, creates some challenges for these small entities or practitioners and small practices, because we know they have their ethical requirements to maintain their competence. But this was really stressed to us as a serious problem in practice. Next slide, please. How did people cope? In general, well, we found there was a very heavy reliance by both financial statement preparers in large organisations in some cases, and certainly in small practices, on the materials, webinars and templates, etc., that are produced by the Big Four or mid-tier firms, such as the GAAP books that you may be familiar with. People found these were generally more accessible in terms of the language and writing style than standards, and they tended to have text and examples that were much more focused on applied problems. Next click, please. In the public sector, people were relying on documents such as treasurer's instructions or other guidance statements that were, for example, being produced by local government associations. And it may concern you, next click, to be told that there were in some of our interviewees' experience, there were some people who just started with these materials and didn't look at the standards at all, or looked at the standards later. Next slide, please. In addition, we had a number of people say, refers to the importance of the basis for conclusions that underlie standards. I'll come back to this a bit later. There were national or international networks of technical experts, particularly in the private sector. So, for example, we were told about an emerging accounting and auditing issues discussion group, which met on an informal basis from time to time to consider technical issues. There was less evidence of such sort of groups in the public sector, for example. ACAG might be one example, but institutional or jurisdictional differences across states and so forth made this type of get-together a bit more difficult. And certainly, again, at the smaller end of town, we were told that often people would rely on guidance from their auditor or from an external consultant. So that's some of the general observations. Next slide, please. More specifically, we identified really 4 contexts in which standards are frequently having to be interpreted or understood. Firstly, there's the issue of scope. When a transaction arises, which standard or standards apply to that transaction? Once you've identified the applicable accounting standards, what then are the relevant or appropriate criteria or paragraphs that you have to apply? Once you've identified those paragraphs, how do you actually apply them in your specific context? How do they apply to your contracts, for example? And this, I've got this in green here just to signal that this context was the one in which interviewees identified as most commonly the context where issues of understanding arose. And finally, people didn't always understand what was the rationale for the required accounting treatment. So those are the 4 contexts in which specific issues might arise. And we'll look at each of those briefly in turn. Next slide, please. So with respect to the first issue, scope, this typically arose where there were cross-cutting issues. So for instance, rent concessions was given as an example to us, where there was uncertainty about whether one should be referring to IFRS 9 or IFRS 16, for example. Next click. In another context, in the public and private not-for-profit sectors, issues about should we be using AASB 15 or more specifically the not-for-profit 1058. Where do we start? Next slide, please. Interviewees were concerned that if there were differences of opinion about which standards to apply, that could potentially result in a lack of comparability. And so to try and manage those issues, people were going back to the accounting firm materials that I mentioned earlier. We had one entity that tried to develop an index of cross-referencing across standards, but found that a bit of an overwhelming task and stopped. If there are suitable in-house resources, then an entity might develop its own materials and flowcharts. And many, of course, went back to the basis of conclusions to help them understand which standards applied when. The ability to cross-reference both between and within standards was seen as a very valuable process of dealing with this issue, among others. And so better ways of being able to see which identify relevant standards quickly was seen as an important aspect of understanding standards going forward. Next slide, please. Having identified the standards, which are the paragraphs, well, there are a couple of contexts in which this issue arose. One was with respect to transactions that are very complex. So, for example, one for-profit preparer said that some standards like 16, 15 and 9 were very broad, and that sometimes created issues in deciding which bits of the standard should be applied to which transactions. Next slide, please. Another context in which this issue about which paragraphs should be chosen arose when there were perceived gaps in standards. So in the public sector context, for example, there were concerns raised about AASB 16. And I quote, for example, just dealing with lease incentives, the more that we've looked, the more that we've discovered is not there. And that's not just us, that's what others view as well. So there may be types of aspects of transactions that are not anticipated within the standard. Next slide, please. Again, in trying to cope with that type of problem, people referred back to the accounting firm materials, or many looked to flowcharts within standards or supporting material, or flowcharts and templates that were provided by accounting firms as a way of navigating around which paragraphs should be adopted. Next slide, please. I would note, just as an aside, by the way, that we had one for-profit preparer, while I'm talking about flowcharts, who, when it came to AASB 15, ended up producing an in-house flowchart that was 100 pages long. So I'm not sure how they got around to applying it, but apparently it was useful. The third context was, once we've identified the relevant requirements, how do we actually take those and apply them in our specific context? And this was seen as the most common context when understanding of standards was a challenge. Typically, it rose in the context of measurement and disclosure issues. The problem was not so much that people couldn't understand what the requirements were, but they had issues about deciding whether they had sufficient information or whether there were their set of specific facts. How did they map to the rules or principles that were in the standard? So this is an issue of trying to match facts and assumptions into the requirements of the standard. Next slide, please. So one example here was to note that if you were a major company, for instance, a major listed company, you were often entering into contracts that were highly complex. And so there might be any number of clauses in the contract that trigger or potentially trigger different requirements. So trying to work out how did those terms of the contracts map to the requirements of the standard could be a challenge, either because of the contracts themselves or some uncertainties or incomplete facts. Next slide, please. In other cases, standards were difficult to apply simply because the interviewees felt that they were very poorly written standards. AASB 17 and AASB 1058 were specifically singled out for this as being very difficult standards to read. In trying to cope with this situation where how do our facts matched with the requirements of the standard, people frequently referred to examples. Examples in the standards, for example, were seen to be helpful, but only to a very limited extent, because examples in standards tended to deal with the vanilla type issues. They tended to state the obvious and weren't typically addressing situations where there was more grey or uncertainty. The accounting firm materials also were seen as helpful, as they were a bit more applied, it was perceived, but even then many felt there could be more examples. Next slide, please. And finally, in terms of these categories of understanding, was the issue of whether or not people understood why the standard required what it did. Many interviewees noted that this wasn't always a very high priority. Many people just wanted to know, what did they have to do? What were the rules they had to follow? But as some of our other speakers today have indicated, if you understand the rationale for the standard, that can help you educate others about why that financial information takes the form that it does, or why the rules take the form that they do, particularly when the outcomes may be seen as counterintuitive or wrong. Next click, please. Again, the basis for conclusions was seen as a really important vehicle or resource for helping understand why standards were as they were and what they required. Our interviewees differed about whether or not standards should say more about the rationale for a standard at perhaps the beginning of it. Some thought this was a really important concept or important attribute that standards should have, whereas others felt that it would just make the standards even longer. Next slide, please. There are some other issues. We've already heard some discussion today about changes being made in standards, sometimes with not very wide consultation, sometimes very late in the process. For those who were small practitioners or in small practices or small entities, they often felt that the resources that were available, particularly things like roundtables or webinars, were not very inclusive for them because they were typically pitched or so they argued, typically pitched for people who had a strong technical knowledge of the standard already anyway. Next click. There was a lot of concern too about the accounting standards themselves or the way that they are available in terms of technology. So many people complained about or were concerned that standards on the AASB website are there in a PDF format. This is very clunky, old technology that made them difficult to use and search, relatively difficult to search. Many people were concerned about improvements to the AASB website. Many felt was not always easy to find the most up-to-date version of standards, particularly when standards were in the process of being compiled, for example, or many weren't aware of the supplementary material that was available. We had a number of interviewees note that they were aware of circumstances where people instead went looking for standards on Google and were getting quite out-of-date versions. Next slide, please. Those interviewees from the not-for-profit and public sectors felt that there's still issues in translating the for-profit standards across into the peculiarities of the not-for-profit and public sectors, and some even felt that there needs to be even more public sector and not-for-profit representation on the AASB. Just a couple more slides. I appreciate I'm just over time, but just quickly. So our conclusions are that the standards are perceived as very complex documents that are not easy to read or understand. Many recognise that this came from the fact that many transactions that were now being dealt with by standards were much more complex than traditionally. But the length of standards, the ability to navigate through them was pretty overwhelming, particularly for those entities that had very limited resources. And in those cases, they were really looking for a return to simplicity. Next slide. Maybe a couple of clicks, Kathleen. Yep. In terms of our recommendations, firstly, we think it would be really a sort of very practical thing that could be done fairly quickly would be to develop interactive e-versions of standards. The International Accounting Ethics Standards Board provides a good example of this. The ability to provide hyperlinks between paragraphs, examples, etc. Interactive pop-ups with definitions, toolboxes making links to non-authoritative materials and so on. There's room for more advanced examples, maybe in consultation with practitioners, but of course, how long is a piece of string? How many of these examples would you need? And would they be relevant to everyone? Next click, please. The use of flowcharts and templates, there's more room for these. The value of these can't be overstated, I think. If we have a click, please, Kathleen. When we were discussing AASB 17 with one interviewee, for example, they pointed to the length of the standard, 84 pages, plus another 68 for the basis of conclusions, but they were unaware, as far as we could tell, of this one-page summary of the insurance model that's available on the IASB website. So again, that's not capturing all the detail, but certainly capturing the main points in a concise way. And one more click, please. A couple of other recommendations relate to the standard setting process. I've already mentioned the the concerns that, that some people who are not technical experts feel disenfranchised, maybe avoiding last minute changes or ensuring that there's some road testing of how these new standards might work, particularly in the not-for-profit or public sector. 2 more clicks. And we think the AASB may need to reconsider its role as an educator. Many people were, it was argued, were reading standards as reference material and not really understanding the underlying background to those standards and their rationale. And many felt this was being reinforced by, if you go to a typical technical update session, the people presenting it are just representing the rules, not really providing an underlying understanding. And finally, and my apologies for slightly going over time, there's room for the AASB to rethink the website to make it easier to identify which versions of standards people are looking at and increasing the awareness of any extra material. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that was of interest. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. Sorry, Case. We're just moving on to the panel discussion session, and I will just introduce the panelists we have for today. Firstly, we have Andrew Hunter from the CPA Australia. So Andrew is the Chief Executive Officer at CPA Australia since joining CPA in early 2018. Andrew has driven a change agenda focused on delivering value to members and enhancing the reputation of the CPA designation. Andrew is currently implementing a 3-year strategy that was developed in close collaboration with the members at each stage of the process, and which charts a clear path for the CPA Australia. And we also have Jen Mead from the Australian National Audit Office. Jen is a Group Executive Director in the Professional Service and Relationships Group and joined the ANAO in 2016. Jen has responsibility for assisting the Auditor General in the application of professional standards, the quality assurance framework, and external relationship management. Prior to her appointment with the ANAO, Jen was a National Technical Partner at RSM Australia and also has held roles with Tower Australia Limited and Deloitte. Jen is currently a member of the Forum for International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, institution's professional pronouncement, and former member of the Australian Auditing and Assurance Standard Board. We also have David Wilson from the First Sentier. So David has been with the First Sentier for 5 years, where he is a portfolio manager managing the Colonial First State Wholesale Geared Share Fund. Prior to that, David was a head of research and sales at UBS within the investment bank. This followed 20 years as at JP Morgan, where he was a head of research and a stock analyst covering the transport, industrial, and telecom sectors. Last but not least, we have David McElry from the Australian Institute of the Company Director. David is a senior policy advisor with the AICD focusing on reporting issues. David is a lawyer and has worked in politics and the not-for-profit sector. He is a former director of the industry superannuation fund Host Plus. So to facilitate today's session, we have the chair of the AASB, Dr. Kees Kendall. Kees joined the AASB as a chair in May 2020. Before joining the AASB, Kees was previously a member of the Administrative Appeal Tribunal, partner at the Rigby Cook Lawyers, Victorian barrister, and also senior lecturer at La Trobe University. So Kees' experience across law, academia, accounting, and government. Kees is also a member of the New Zealand Accounting Standard Board. So I will hand over to Kees for the panel discussion. Thanks, Kees.
Thanks very much for that, Al. The first question I had is directed to David McElray. David, your members as directors have duties in relation to financial statements under the Corporations Act, and often these directors are not accountants. What sort of feedback do you get from directors on the understandability of accounting standards?
Thanks, Keith, and thanks for having me today. Well, similar feedback, I think, to what you saw from Brian's research, really. They are, just to anyone who's not an accountant such as myself, they are difficult. They are difficult to understand. So, and they are intimidating documents to try and grapple with. So, you've pointed out already too, for a director, you have obligations under the Corporations Act, for example. When you do your financial report, you have to give a declaration that it complies with accounting standards. So a director has to be able to engage with these standards on some level. But they are intimidating, and I think, for example, in recent examples, the changes that you saw to the expected credit loss standard, I think that was a recent one. I've spoken to some directors of large listed companies, very experienced former accountants, and they struggled interpreting what that meant. So I think Brian's research, I think, would be borne out from all my discussions with directors, and indeed my own, I would say, my own personal experience.
Right. Well, in light of all that, do you think any of the team's recommendations would help?
Yes, I think so. I thought they were all sensible recommendations. I think, you know, from the practical ones that Brian set out, I mean, I think they're probably more aimed at the practitioners. It'd be rare that a director would go and say, search the AASB website. But I think the problem probably that you have, Keith, more than anyone else, is obviously you have to balance your desire to align with international standards, which sort of come passed down to you to an Australian context. But you know, as in the process of doing that, the plainer that they are, the more plain English they are, the more that you're able to make them explicable to a non-accountant, the better. So that would be the other thing that, you know, was said by Brian, but not necessarily specified, that that would be good. But I accept that you are sort of caught on the horns of a dilemma at the AASB. And I've got to say, actually, it's very refreshing to have this presentation, you to be so upfront about that. I think that's very good of you.
Yeah, well, thanks for those thoughts, David. Just finally, do you have any other suggestions or feedback for standard setters to improve the understandability of standards?
No, nothing. I think that Brian hasn't covered off, except I mean, I think just to be, you know, from the director's perspective, be kind to directors. You know, I've already spoken about their statutory obligations, their legal responsibilities, and following the famous Chentro case after the GFC, the expectation on directors is higher, I think, both legally and most directors would feel that as well. So I think you don't want directors, generally non-executive directors I'm talking about here, getting into the weeds, but at the same time, you would expect them to be able to work with their accountants, with their auditors and so forth, to have some understanding of how that standard should be applied, particularly if it's significant to their enterprise. So anything that could assist them in doing that, probably principally in the plain English drafting, I think would be most welcome.
Well, thank you very much, David. Next question is directed to Andrew Hunter. Andrew, for members of CPA, we expect the majority of them would use accounting standards in their day-to-day work and would need to keep up with changes in the issuance of standards. Have you heard any feedback from your members on the understandability of accounting standards? Sorry, Andrew, you're on mute.
Thank you, Keith. Sorry about that. Yeah, we do hear from our members on a regular basis on this topic, it's difficult to sort of come up with a simple solution. You know, we acknowledge that accounting standards are complex. There's no question they're absolutely complicated, but it doesn't necessarily inhibit their understandability, depending, of course, on your degree of technical expertise. And I think one of the challenges over many years is the group of people who are capable of understanding a set of accounting standards has been getting smaller and smaller. But that said, the availability of resources to enable people to understand accounting standards has actually broadened. So there is a lot of information available, which you can find on websites that do go into interpretation and application of financial or of accounting standards and how you use them for preparing financial statements. Certainly at CPA Australia, we see financial reporting as being foundational to becoming an accountant. It's a compulsory subject. But we recognise that what you learn in financial reporting with us is an important foundation, but it doesn't necessarily give you that deep understanding that you need as a preparer or auditor of financial standards. And I said before, I don't know whether there is a simple solution. The technical complexity that we see in accounting standards today very much reflects the world that we live in. So, we have very complex global businesses, very complex economies, and the IFRS framework that has been developed is trying to meet the needs of a very broad church of financial statement preparers and ultimately the investors and the users of these financial statements. So we've got this framework that's trying to support different economies, developed and developing jurisdictions that have got different types of governments. We've got a wide range of industries and business sectors. So we've got a set of accounting standards that are trying to cater to a very, very broad audience. And therefore understandability, when we listen to our members, has now started to get confined to a smaller and smaller group of people. I recall in Brian's presentation, he called out the new lease accounting standard. Not all of the accounting standards adequately deal with all of the issues, and in that particular accounting standard, it doesn't adequately address lease incentives. And then the other bit, just to add, that we hear from our members here in Australia, which is a further complication, is we do have an approach here in Australia, which is called transaction neutral when it comes to standard setting. And it means we have a framework for unlisted corporates, the public sector, and even private not-for-profits, which is the same. And that brings with it challenges. So we look at AASB 15, revenue from contracts with customers, and that gives rise to challenges. I think it works very well for commercial transactions, but if you look at a university that receives a research grant up front, it doesn't work so well for non-commercial transactions. But one of the positives, without sounding too negative about it all, one of the positives we see, particularly around transaction neutrality, is the skills that you do develop in understanding accounting standards are transferable between sectors. So we see that as a big positive.
Thank you for that. Now, the research suggests modernisation of the way we access standards. Do you have any perspective on whether this would benefit members?
Yeah, our members are definitely keen to see that happen. We know, and Brian mentioned this, that a lot of the accounting standards appear in PDF form. So they're essentially written as a paper-based document, and there's a sequential approach to having to read and use them. And I think that does create challenges in understandability, and we have heard that from our members. We are supportive of the use of accompanying material. We think illustrative examples are great. Implementation guidance is good. The basis for conclusions are terrific. But there is further complications and challenges in understandability when you overlay on top of that the IFRS Interpretations Committee, which issues agenda decisions, and they must be considered when preparing IFRS financial statements. But we do support the digitising of accounting standards as recommended in the research report. And that's the direction that the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board is going. So we would encourage the IASB to consider the same. We know that the AUASB is currently looking at a project to digitise its auditing standards, and we would encourage the AASB to explore how they can leverage the learnings and experience of the AUASB. So that's the feedback we're getting from our members.
Finally, the research puts forward recommendations to possibly give more examples targeted to complex transactions as well as different industries. But it also acknowledges that this might lead to longer standards and confusion as to the circumstances that particular examples apply to. Now, from your perspective, representing your members, do you think it would be more helpful to develop standards with more examples or implementation guidance with this in mind?
Well, that's the dilemma, isn't it, Keith? We very much support principles-based accounting standards that require professional judgment. And I know within the CPA program, we have an expectation of our members from the day that they join, that they are aware of the need to develop and exercise professional judgment. And we know that the accounting profession is changing rapidly. We can see that emerging technologies like AI and big data and robotics, for example, are going to reduce the need for people to do the number crunching. But the good news, I think, for the accountants is we can focus on the more interesting jobs that require higher end interpretation and analysis and decision making. And principles-based accounting standards actually aligns really well with that. So we are a supporter of implementation guidance and illustrative examples. We think they are essential accompaniments to principle-based accounting standards. And within the research report, one of the recommendations is to use more flowcharts and visual representations, and certainly we would be a supporter of that. You've then got to balance that with the fact that accounting standards will become longer. They are already long. You look at AASB 15, revenue from contracts with customers, and that's already 300 plus pages. But to the extent that we can add those valuable things and they result in a longer standard, we would still be supportive.
Well, thank you for that, Andrew. Next question is directed to David Wilson here. As a user, David, are you able to easily understand the accounting concepts and technicalities underlying the information contained in the financial statements?
Well, thanks for the question, Keith, and it's a pleasure to be here. In fact, it's interesting when you think about what buy-side and sell-side analysts do, and they're actually all quite sort of accounting literate, but just because of sort of workloads, they don't necessarily get involved in looking at accounting standards. They're very much reliant on sort of whether it be Big Four or mid-tier or other interpretations, academic interpretations of the accounting standards. So they really just through sheer workload. And to give you a little bit of perspective around that, so the team I work in at First Sentier, we'd be one of the larger funds management groups. And so we have 7 analysts, and we cover, analyse, model, cash flow statements, income statements, all the rest of it on 190 companies. And so therefore, we're very, very reliant on the application and interpretation of accounting standards by accounting firms and companies, rather than getting involved ourselves in looking at those accounting standards. And that's despite the fact that, we are actually, a lot of us, probably 60-70%, are actually the very accounting literate.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, taking a slightly different lens, do you have any observations on the financial statements overall? In other words, are the financial statements themselves understandable?
I think the one thing, if you surveyed sort of, again, usability and applicability of accounting standards into the into the investment community, and again, I highlight that we're in the for-profit, so I can't really speak for not-for-profit in the public sector. But I think that the core, we live in an underlying pro forma world, but that underlying pro forma world that we look at needs to be entirely referable back to the sort of statutory world, or reported accounting standard world that the people on this call live in. because again, just through sheer volume of companies that we're required to look at, we need to be able to simply, we do look to get to a world where, or sort of a set of accounts that relate to underlying profit or pro forma profit or pro forma balance sheet or cash flow. But again, we need to be able to refer, actually be able to sort of translate that back to actually sort of reported numbers. So we're looking for sort of simplicity around that. So it's simplicity of application of accounting standards as well as simplicity of accounting standards. And to give you an idea, AASB 16 is a very, very good example. It basically required us at First Sentier to rebuild all our cash flow statements, income statements, and balance sheets as a bit of a refresh, but to be able to properly use that new accounting standard for all 190 companies when that was introduced.
Right. And finally, what are some of the resources that you would use or rely on for a better understanding of accounting standards or technical issues when needed?
At first blush, we tend to, a bit like the directors that Brian referenced. We would go to the accountants, particularly accountants at the companies themselves. But beyond that, in a more general, we will engage with either Big Four or mid-tier accounting firms to get us educated, because we see it's, the sort of application of accounting standards absolutely crucial to the role that we perform in terms of allocating capital. But we just, even though we feel as though we have the skills to engage with that, we just do not have the time to actually go through, as we've heard today, the sort of complexity of those accounting standards, despite the fact that we are very heavy users of it whole thing.
Thank you for that, David. Now, my final lot of questions directed to Jane. Jane, from a public sector perspective, do you have any additional recommendations from what the researchers have put through? For example, is applying IFRS standards understandable in the public sector context?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I'm not sure that I can add recommendations as such. Probably more food for thought is probably where I'll be coming from with that question. I guess it's interesting from the public sector and similarly in the private not-for-profit sector, you end up with a number of layers that can impact on the understandability of standards. So because the IFRS standards aren't sextant neutral, they're based at for-profit private sector land, the AASB, I guess, are the first port of call for trying to make the requirements understandable in the public sector context. And I think, generally that's done fairly well. I guess I want to make a distinction too, and I think Andrew mentioned this briefly, a distinction between complexity and understandability. While there can be complexity, I think there's a number of ways to achieve more understandability, and I think, in the public sector context, that gets done in a number of ways, often by the Departments of Finance and Treasury. I think they have a large role to play in understandability of standards and do play a large role in putting out guidance. In my experience, from the audit context, most entities tend to look to the guidance that is put out by the Departments of Finance and Treasury in their various jurisdictions rather than the standards as such. But I mean, I look at something like AASB 15 and 1058, for example. I think that was one area where there was just so much in the public sector context that we probably didn't realise until people started preparing their financial statements and auditors started auditing those, that there was a lot of nuances in the public sector context that meant that the standards may not have been as understandable in that context because they sort of were things that hadn't necessarily been considered. And that's not through anybody's fault, because it's just a case of, you don't know what's there until you do it. So I think, as I say, there's a number of layers for achieving understandability in the public sector context, but it is a very difficult job for the AASB to have to come in and make those standards sector neutral, and then to add the additional layer of interpretation, where we try and get some consistency across audit officers and also across the members of HODRAC, the Departments of Finance and Treasury. So I don't think I've made any more recommendations, but that's just some food for thought.
No, thanks, Jane. But As an auditor, what's your experience in keeping audit teams up to date on education?
Yeah, there's a lot of work to do in that, and my team is responsible for that within the ANAO. Again, you know, because there is quite a lot of complexity in the standards. There is a lot of need for education. It's the same within the firms. I you know, having come from private sector background, that there really is a lot of work to do, and that I guess that also then comes to the fact that, you know, the audit teams, would they necessarily sit and read standards every day? Probably not. I think there's that reliance on the technical areas that Brian referred to, which then leads to a need for a lot of education for the team, so that you can actually give them the tools that they need to apply those standards in a practical context. So I think there's a lot of work gets done there outside the standard setting framework, I think, by auditors in helping their teams apply those standards.
Thanks, Jane. And just one final question. Do you have any suggestions or feedback for standard setters? For example, how do we improve our outreach to make it more accessible to such a diverse range of stakeholders?
Yeah, I think it's a really important area, and I think the comments that Brian made in his presentation, I mean, I have been to roundtables when I was sort of in the private sector and also in the public sector, and I think generally the outreach is there. I think when it comes to, I guess, public sector, for example, there could be a need for sometimes a slightly better coordinated outreach. We sort of work through, I guess, the ACAG network, so the Australasian Councils of Auditors General, where we'll try and get some consistency across our views of how we would interpret a particular standard, and HOTARAC are the same with the Departments of Finance and Treasury. So I think my main sort of advice, for want of a better word, for what it's worth, in outreach is for the AASB to always make sure they're engaging at that level, rather than sort of through individual level where you may have different interpretations of standards. And that's the way that we try to communicate. I think, yeah, it's sort of maybe sometimes if I'm looking at sort of the comments that were made, this just off the top of my head from Brian, maybe some of the outreach could be done at various levels for different stakeholders. So for, you know, sort of rather than a big room that, as you mentioned, it can be quite intimidating for people that might not be a technical guru but still want to have some contribution, it might be useful for some outreach to be broken up into various groups to make sure that you are getting that feedback.
Oh, thanks very much for that, Jane. Right, I might hand over to Mark to lead the Q&A now. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Keith. And so there are a number of questions here, so I'll start with these. One which is probably best placed for Brian to first comment on, but I note we've got a couple of lawyers on the panel, and including our chair, and so they might also like to comment. And the observation that's made is that few people complain about the law. For example, the general criminal law is complex. Tax law is complex. They pay lawyers to interpret what those laws mean. It's incredibly, they're both incredibly hard to understand. Why would we expect accounting standards to be different? Why should that not also require appropriate qualifications? Transactions are complex. Accounting is not simple. It's a skill, and therefore that's reflected in the, I suppose, the construction of the accounting standard. So, Brian, first, your thoughts.
Well, it sounds like a leading question. Look, I would agree that you know, we are a profession, and so the expectations of the language of how the profession conducts itself and what it does is going to be different from the general layperson. I think I would be concerned, though, that well, just as in the law or medicine, people ask for a second opinion, and consumers are now much more prepared to question. I think there would be, it would be appropriate to be concerned that high levels of technical understanding are getting smaller and smaller and smaller in terms of who's in charge of them, rather than necessarily you know, that it's an issue about this interpretation role that a certain small group of people are playing relative to the person who's supposed to be, or the entity that's supposed to be setting the rules, which of course is the AASB or the IASB, depending on the framework. So as always in these things, there's a balance, but yes, I mean, we know from the conceptual framework, for example, that we're writing standards not for the layperson, we're writing it for, or we're writing financial statements, preparing financial statements for people with some reasonable level of knowledge. I guess the open question is what's reasonable in this case.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Perhaps David McElrea, do you have an opinion?
Sure. I was just going to say, it didn't take long for the accountants to have a go at the lawyers, did it? It always happens pretty quickly, and vice versa. And far be it from me to defend it by defending lawyers either. I think that any time a profession acts as a gatekeeper like that, you sometimes have to question whether the profession's doing a right thing. And I know way back when I was at law school, we were told that it was all being simplified to make it easier to access. I'm not sure that that's true, but that was certainly a movement back then. That's probably over 20 years ago. So again, I think it goes to a point that Andrew made, though. What do you want to do as a professional, as an accountant? You don't want to be there as the gatekeeper, the sole repository of some technical knowledge. What's interesting, this is true of lawyers and accountants, I think, is applying that and getting to use your judgment. That's when your job is interesting, and that's when you add the most value, rather than just providing technical access, which in the days of artificial intelligence potentially loses more and more usefulness anyway. So that would be my answer to that. I don't think that's, I sort of accept some premise of the point, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try and improve it.
Thanks, David. Keith?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. As an accountant and lawyer, I'm either very conflicted on this or not conflicted at all. I'm not sure which, but the way I see things, and this echoes both what Brian and David were saying, I think, in that, look, with the level of directors and knowledge that directors are expected to have, and this goes for other areas of the law as well, they're not expected to be technical experts. So directors never going to get pulled up on the application of paragraph 100 of AASB 16 to a particular scenario. It's a more general sense, and I'm not aware of this ever having been tested, directors' level of knowledge being tested in the context of accounting standards, but extrapolating from other areas, it is what the reasonable person would who would be operating in that scenario. So the reasonable director, if you like. So they're not expected to be technical accounting experts in the same way they're not expected to be experts in commercial criminal law. It's one thing to say that accountants are gatekeepers, but they are the technical experts, and it's perfectly legitimate for a level of reliance on the same way they rely on legal advisors. But directors do still need to take a general level of responsibility for what is produced by the boards, including the financial statements.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Now, there are some sort of a series of questions which are, related again to the writing. So perhaps I'll just start with Brian. That was just in terms of a view about an accounting standard, the need for precision in writing versus readability, and how those difference in factors might actually play out in what is the accounting standard. What we actually see is the form of the accounting standard.
Okay. Well, I'm a believer in precision. I think one can, well, as I hoped I tried to get across, I think one can overplay this issue of readability, because readability, I think, is relative to the context in which you're talking about. And we mentioned earlier, you know, our ability to understand what we're reading is partly a function of our education and our shared understanding of what we're talking about. So I think that when you're talking from one accounting professional to another accounting professional, we ought to be able to talk with precision. I think the issues have come down more to ones of resourcing, for example, whether people have sufficient time even to process the large volume of material that they're being asked to process. So you've got this trade-off that with, you know, the IASB is trying to cope with a variety of jurisdictions across an almost infinite variety of fact situations. So, you know, how precise do the principles need to be can turn into too many rules that in fact impact on the ability to properly apply the standard, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay then. Now look, I'll move on to, here's a question that's actually being asked of Jane. So, oh, now it's just, sorry, let me just find where that's gone to. Disappeared off my screen. No, I'm sorry. I'll have to come back to another question. Sorry, Jane, you'll have to wait for that. It's just disappeared for me. Okay. A question that's been put though around. There's a number of questions here that really relate to the accounting standards as they apply to not-for-profit entities. And I think they could be really taken from the fact that you're starting with international financial reporting standards that are written for a particular sector, and then either making variations within the standard by an additional paragraph or something within a standard to address not-for-profit matters, or in the case of AASB 1058, developing a standalone standard specific for the not-for-profit sector, but that utilises or works in with a IFRS-based accounting standard. Do you see that some of the problems that you've observed or we're observing, according to today's discussion, are coming from that approach? Again, perhaps I should start with Brian, given Brian's presented on the research, and then I can ask some others.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I guess I'd pick up some issues that perhaps Jane and others have spoken about earlier. We didn't find anyone, for example, who had any problem with the issue of transaction neutrality, but they often felt that there may be peculiarities in the way contracts, if you like, are structured, or the way things are done in the not-for-profit or public sector. And that for whatever reason, how those standards apply in those sectors is not, or the practicality of applying them in those sectors is not necessarily being captured before the standard is being finalised. And as Jane said, people are discovering issues once they start implementing them. So we had one or two interviewees who talked about, well, you know, if only we'd got together earlier and discuss this amongst ourselves as to how such and such a term or clause or paragraph would play out in our jurisdiction. And whereas it would seem that the private for-profit sector is a bit more, for want of a better word, coordinated to have those sort of discussions, differences in jurisdictions or whatever it might be seem to suggest that this is not happening as easily in the public or not-for-profit private sectors.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a response? Because I've now found the question that I was going to ask of Jane. It's reappeared on my screen.
Mark, if I could just jump in on that too. I think,
yes,
look, we get a lot of feedback as directors from not-for-profit organisations, managers about difficulties. And I think this is where the AASB, I should have brought this up earlier, can play a role, because you do have the option of having different standards to general purpose standards applying to not-for-profits. And I know the AASB is sort of looking at this as a project. And again, I think that's to be commended, especially where you think about thresholds where you might have different standards, including cash accounting for very small not-for-profits who don't really need to have, certainly don't need to have general purpose financial statements. So I think that's another way where if you want to have transaction neutrality, you can still have some different thresholds and a proportionality approach which recognises that not-for-profit smaller organisations don't have the same user needs or internal needs as others.
Thank you, David. So the question here that Jane's indicated that she would like to answer, but others are going to be welcome to. Interested in the views of the members of the panel regarding the usefulness of guidance provided by the AASB staff in the Q&A, frequently asked questions publications issued by them. And examples have been AASB 1058, more recently on valuations of assets and impairments in the circumstances of the pandemic. So Jane, first instance.
Yeah, I think some of those documents can be extremely useful for getting some understandability, particularly and I guess I'm answering from the public sector, and similarly for the not-for-profit sector, there can be some usefulness there. There's always going to be a limit to how many scenarios you can put in a document. I think then consultation also becomes very important, particularly with things like AASB Q&As and staff papers, which aren't going to necessarily have the same status as standards, but are a AASB interpretation of those standards. So I think to make sure that they do improve the understandability of standards, the consultation sort of, I guess, at the right levels and with the right parts of each sector are really important for those. But I think given that, as I say, I'm sort of a bit biased talking for the public sector and the not-for-profit. The IASB put out a lot of materials that can be used by the private sector. The firms put out their books, all the things that Brian spoke about. The guidance that we sort of, have outside those sectors is really limited, as I say, to what's put out in the public sector by Departments of Finance and Treasury and by the AASB. So it's just really important, I think, to always make sure that we sort of, think those issues through, get the consultation right, but they certainly do help with understandability if they're done well.
Okay, thank you. David Wilson, I think earlier you said that your use of accounting standards would not be that great because they probably don't, but what about the use of, I'm going to say, supporting material such as this AASB questions and answers and other guidance? Would that be something that you might make use of?
Yes, we do, and so the sort of simple examples, and just sort of more the sort of the thinking around the behind the accounting, also rather than the sort of mechanics of the accounting standard, and so the purpose of the accounting standard, I think, is actually important for the investing sort of population.
Okay. Thank you.
Mark, if I can just pick up a point from there.
Yes, Brian.
One of our interviewees made the interesting observation that standards are typically written almost like reference material, and that what they're not really written like is to provide the underlying understanding and rationale and to communicate that to the people who are using those standards or the end products of the standards. And so this sort of goes back to our earlier comments about the need to sort of educate people out there about what is available. It surprises me that, as I think Andrew mentioned, and others have mentioned, there's no shortage of things for people to refer to, but one is getting them to refer in the first place. A second point is getting them to refer to the stuff that's actually up to date, not the old versions of the standards. And thirdly, sort of just helping them understand what they're reading, what they should be reading.
Thank you. Andrew, there's a question here that you might like to answer, and it relates to well, it's really pointing to the fact that the accounting standards, we have the accounting standards and we have the conceptual framework for financial reporting, and we don't always see consistency between the two. Do you think that that might be a factor that is causing the type of issues that Brian has identified in his research?
Yeah, it could well be. I think the biggest challenge in all this is actually for the accountants and the preparers of financial statements and the users and the directors in relatively smaller entities. Like I spent most of my career working for a bank. I worked for Macquarie for over 20 years. Spent a lot of time working on transactions, and I could always actually find a good resource within Macquarie to help me account for a transaction we were working on. And if they didn't know the answer, well, invariably they would always go and check with, someone in, one of the top sort of 6-8 accounting firms. So we always had access to resources to get the answers. And I think the challenge for smaller organisations is, if they do come across an inconsistency between the conceptual framework and they're reading a particular accounting standard, they may not have the financial resources to go to the top 6-8 accounting firms to get the answer. So they sort of try and muddle through on their own. And finding the right answer is not necessarily easy. As I said at the beginning, I think our accounting standards are actually, they're complicated, but for professionals who have deep technical expertise in this area, I actually do think they're understandable. But for your, I would say for a significant number of our members who are, fantastic accountants and very well qualified, but not necessarily immersed in the detail of an accounting standard every day, they would find some of this incredibly difficult. And these conflicts that do come up inevitably between the conceptual framework and the actual accounting standard are, they're inevitable.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. There's a question which I'll sort of paraphrase in a slightly different way from the way it's put, but it's probably relevant if we think about some of these accounting standards projects that we have seen completed in recent times. And I'm thinking internationally, the leases, insurance, and then domestically for the not-for-profit in terms of revenue. I mean, these projects have not just been 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, but they're sort of 15 year, 20 year projects. And I suppose if we think about that, the comment, the observation that was made by one of the participants is that with these projects being so lengthy, the teams that are involved in the development of the accounting standards have been involved with them for years and years and years in many cases. And so therefore there becomes I suppose, a team speak that they understand well what they're trying to reflect in the accounting standard, but that it might be problematic for those who are outside of that particular network. And I'm just wondering if there's something that you might suggest that could be done to try, other than speeding up process, something that could be done to perhaps address that sort of possibility in terms of the finalisation of the accounting standard. Any takers on that?
Well, I'll get started, and while the others are thinking,
Right.
I'm sure they've better responses than me. I guess that's partly why we have due process, isn't it? That we have due process over this period of time for people to feed in their thoughts and their experiences and their concerns. Maybe that process can be done better. I think Adam in the earlier session today was talking about, that over time the exposure draft or the position keeps changing, and we had one or two interviewees who's referring, for example, to the insurance standard to say there's really very, very late changes in that for which people really had no time to adequately engage or even understand what the implications were. So to the extent that the standard setting process can avoid it's that latter type of problem. And it's obviously going to change over time as the due process goes. But last minute changes or that sort of thing where people don't have time to process it adequately, I don't know that that happens very often, but you'd want to avoid it if you could, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Andrew.
I agree with Brian there. I don't think there's a shortage of consultation, but one of the recommendations in the research report is greater involvement of non-technical accountants. So I would define those as people who are well qualified in accounting, but not necessarily immersed in a standard, but might use it to give them a standard in its near complete form or getting closer to it, to say, what do you think? Any comments on it? Now, you've heard my earlier comments. I think it's inevitable in a complex world you will have complex standards, and they are going to be long. But these non-technical people will give you a perspective of a user that you're obviously going to get some great input from people who work in the Big Four and the big account, the mid-tier accounting firms. But there are a very significant number of people who are using accounting standards outside of those entities, and them having a bigger role in input into standards, I think, could be beneficial.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Jane, do you think that there would be sort of a take-up in the public sector of that, from the public sector agencies of that particular point that Andrew has spoken to?
Do you mean about sort of going beyond the sort of technical people, that
Yes.
point? Yeah. No, I think that's. I was just thinking to myself, that's probably something that we could do better when we're consulted, rather than sort of as a group of technical people sitting together and coming up with a submission to the AASB. Sometimes it's a matter of timeliness and that, but it's probably useful, I think, for the firms and the audit officers, for example, to think about doing that. So, make it less the AASB's job, because it might be useful for when, as I say, for us to sort of reach out, I guess, a little bit broader. It can be difficult, as I say, it depends on sort of the amount of time that there is to get submissions and things together. When we're putting in a submission on behalf of ACAG, we're bringing all the audit officers together, trying to get consistency. So that sort of takes quite a bit of time as well. So, but I think it's an excellent point that Andrew makes, and I think that would be something that would be as useful in the public sector as the private. Yeah.
And perhaps if I could just ask the same of David McElrea, given that within the AICD you'd have a number of different committees, and I'm thinking that, well, at least in the past, you would have had one that had a focus on financial reporting matters, but could you make the use of some of your other committees also to be engaged in that sort of final moments?
Yeah, well, and we still do, and I think I'm going through the same process as Jane, just reflecting on whether that might be a useful contribution to make, rather than the probably the nitpicking that we otherwise do on the consultation, which I'm sure the AASB very much appreciate. So, but I think that's absolutely something that directors, users could do, and we'd be very happy to think about how we can provide that third-party assistance or that user assistance in that drafting stage, or even just the preparation of explanatory materials where they exist.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add, Mark?
Yes, Dave. Yeah.
I just add that the user advisor committee.
I think we've just might have lost David there for a moment. Okay, I'll move on to. Yep, you're back. No, maybe not. Hi, David. We just missed your last. We just missed your last comments there, David.
Back again. Yeah, I was just saying that we entirely, for instance, entirely ignore the accounting standard that amortizes acquired intangibles. You know, as an example. But but helpfully we're able to provide something on that user.
Okay then. Thank you. Look, thank you very much. And I think that we've actually reached, according to my phone here, 3:45. So I'd like to thank Brian for his presentation that certainly has raised some interesting discussion, particularly from our participants, and in the way in which the panelists and led there by our facilitator Keith have spoken to those issues, and it's all been, I think, very interesting. So thank you, Brian, and thanks to David and Jane and Andrew and Keith. Thank you very much. And I'll pass over to Al.
Thanks, everyone. And we will now just take our final short break before returning to hear from the AISB board member and Taka. And to close off what has been a great day, we will recommence at 4 o'clock. See you all later. Thank you.
Her previous position was Professor at the University of Western Australia's Business School and Head of the Accounting and Finance Group. She qualified as a Chartered Accountant in 1985 and has a PhD in Accounting from the University of Western Australia. She was an accounting teacher and researcher at the university from 1996 and a professor from 2011. Professor Taka served as a member of the AASB from 2014 to 2017 and was the Research Director from the AASB from February to July 2017. She was an academic fellow of the IFRS Foundation from 2011 to 2012. She was a co-author on a leading accounting theory textbook and has written a wide range of research papers related to IFRS standards, for which she has received many awards. Professor Taka has been an active member of the international accounting academic community, having served on several boards and committees. So welcome, Anne, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today. This has just been a great event. We've had such excellent comments from the speakers, such depth of discussion. It's been really valuable, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and be part of it with you. I thank the AASB for great organisation and for everyone who's participated. Next slide, please, Kathleen. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the IASB and research. You know that the IASB is required to undertake what we call evidence-based standard setting. Now that standard, that evidence can come from a whole range of places. I think today we've been focusing on talking about implementation, evidence around implementation. So that's a particular part of the process, but we're actually the IASB gets involved with evidence from before the project, during the project, and after the project. And that evidence comes from many, many different sources, and many of you have been involved in that process in your roles as preparers and auditors, as regulators, as investors. Obviously, evidence comes through the AASB and comes in all sorts of fora, including the one that we've been participating in today. An important source of evidence is also the academic research. Next slide, please, Kathleen. The starting point for the IASB is to determine whether there is a problem to be solved. And I did note today that some of the feedback on leasing that the academics collected said that some people thought there wasn't a problem to be solved with leases. But those of us who've been following that project for many, many years know that there are other views that there was a problem to be solved. The staff of the IFRS Foundation are reading academic papers and other research reports. Indeed, literature reviews are prepared now as part of projects. And so big projects that are on at the moment, like primary financial statements and the Goodwill and Impairment Project, the extractive activities projects, all have academic literature reviews as part of those. And we do communicate that back to you via social media and also via the academic web page, where when you go onto the IFRS Foundation academic web page, you can find notes that we've been putting up, identifying the literature reviews in the papers so that you can see what's going on. Academic literature is also considered in the post-implementation reviews. Now, post-implementation reviews are about determining whether the standard is working as intended. So the kind of discussions that we've enjoyed today, with the variety of views and the great depth of knowledge and experience that's been shared today, are great inputs into a post-implementation review and into understanding whether standards are working as the board intended. 3 have been done, and they are the ones on segment reporting, fair value measurement, and business combinations. And we have 2 about to commence. So we're about to issue the consultation document, the RFI, Request for Information, on IFRS 10, 11, and 12. We've also decided to begin the post-implementation review of IFRS 9, which is a financial instrument standard, but beginning by focusing on classification and measurement. Next slide, please, Kathleen. Our work program. It's been a very busy year. It's been busy for everybody. Isn't it amazing how much work we can do when we are shut up in our little places? So thank goodness for technology. We've done major consultations that are still in progress on some things, but 2020 has seen enormous work from our side, but also from your side on primary financial statements. The comment letters are all in and currently being analysed. The consultation on goodwill and impairment is still open, and looking forward to your feedback on that. Another very important work is the review of the IFRS for SMEs standard, and we are receiving the consultation and information at the moment. Looking forward into next year, so many things still needing your feedback and your comments. Business combinations under common control, we'll be issuing a consultation document. Rate regulated activities, a project that has been around for quite some time, very important to the specific constituents that are concerned with that. We're issuing an exposure draft on that. The management commentary project, which is of great interest to many constituents, is reaching the point of the consultation document. An enormous amount of work has gone into that, and that's about updating the practice statement that we currently have. Another really important area of work is what we call the targeted standards level review of disclosure. This touches on what Brian mentioned when he said the IASB has disclosure initiative projects, responding to many comments that were just made in the last session about complexity and understandability. So we do have major projects in that area, and we're going to come to you and consult about some proposals in relation to disclosure. And finally, on that little list is subsidiaries that are SMEs. This is a project about requiring full recognition and measurement, but allowing entities that are SMEs, that are subsidiaries of IFRS filers, to use the disclosure requirements of the IFRS for SMEs. Now, if that sounds familiar to some people, that is, of course, because Australia does have a standard that involves reduced disclosures along with full recognition and measurement requirements. The next point there is agenda consultation, and I've put it in big letters just for fun. Every 5 years, the IFRS Foundation, the IASB, the staff, we consult on the agenda consultation. And as always, it's a really important consultation because it's your chance to tell us what you think we should be working on. We've heard a lot today about various problems people have with IFRS standards and various ways that they could be improved. A real priority for us is working out where to spend our time and our effort and our energy. And so this agenda consultation will help us do that. And we're going to issue our documents for you to provide feedback. We're going to provide a lot of information about things that you could consider and projects that we've already heard from people that they'd like us to consider. So along with all the other consultations, please give us your views as part of the agenda consultation. We have some ongoing projects that you're familiar with. Dynamic risk management, that's the macro hedging project, part of IFRS 9, must be attended to. We cannot continue indefinitely with hedging under IAS 39. Secondly, the FICE project, a big consultation of the FICE project began when I just joined the board. All that feedback has been received and processed, and the staff have come to the board with proposals of how we should proceed. Again, we're seriously responding to what feedback you give us. This project got taken on because people said there were problems with IAS 32, and we knew there were problems by the volume we heard of comments, the questions going to the interpretations committee. This is the board responding. A lot of board effort now goes to the questions of implementation and application. Previously, a lot of board and staff time went on developing the standards. Several times today, people have referred to the consultation processes that go on, the extensive consultation and changes that happen, the big work to produce those big standards. Subsequent to the release of those big standards, a lot of work is now focused on implementation and application. And I would say that was pretty consistent with what we've heard from people today who have been asking for specific things and for attention to problems that they're experiencing or gaps that they've identified in standards. So there's this constant consideration through the interpretations committee. There's also responses through things like the PIRs. So this whole suite of PIRs coming now will be particularly important. Another ongoing project, close to our hearts in Australia, the Extractive Activities Project. We've had a lot of engagement with Australian stakeholders and with the AASB on this, and that will continue. On our research agenda now is the equity method. It's there because we have commenced the post-implementation review of 10, 11 and 12, and some people tell us that it's connected. So it's been great to hear Tom's presentation today by Tom and his colleagues. It was a great start to our session with our academic papers today, because hearing Tom's careful analysis, the presentation of that data, it's really useful to us. Interested that Tom's conclusions weren't concurring with the board's conclusions in the paper that he was referring to, but that's the robustness of the process. People have different views. I've been very interested to hear several people speak today in support of a comprehensive review in relation to the equity method. Very pleased to hear people asking for specific action on resolving some of those outstanding application issues. That is what the board has nominated to do, hoping to address that first, and then looking to make decisions about how extensive any further review would need to be. Next slide, please, Kathleen. So these post-implementation reviews, the big standards that have been mentioned today, 9, 15, 16, also IFRS 17 insurance has been talked about today. We have the post-implementation reviews in the planning stage. As I've mentioned, the 9 has begun by just looking at classification and measurement. The other stages of 9, we'll get to those in due course. So we're planning for all of them, but we also know that academic research has a long lead time, and to help academics in their planning for research that relates to the big standards, we're planning to produce some webinars. They'll be available firstly as webinars, live webinars, and then as webcasts that will stay on our website. And we're planning to release those in January 2021. So we're already working on them. And the idea for those is to provide some background that is, on the one hand, part of education in the sense of reminding people what the objectives of the standard was, what the problem was trying to be solved, and what expected effects were. Because as we look to the academics, we're actually saying, can you give us a picture of whether the intended objectives were achieved? Can you provide evidence that can help us evaluate that question? So we are outlining what was trying to be achieved by the standards, and then also putting some information there about things we know, things we've already heard about the standard. Maybe there's issues with the standard in particular ways that we've heard about, or particular aspects of change that we'd like to hear about. So they're coming your way. So academic evidence that can help us undertake these PIRs is greatly sought and greatly wanted. Now, what I've heard today is some really, really interesting work that has been based on interviews, and I commend all the researchers for that work because it is so valuable to us. Empirical evidence is useful. The descriptive statistics, for example, in Tom's paper, are things that we make use of. There are academic papers that provide us with that feedback. Very, very useful. There's another side to it. There are always things that can't be gleaned from reading of the financial statements directly, looking at the numbers or taking the numbers from databases. There are always things that can't be gleaned from that. And so this interview work that has been presented today, 3 cases of interview work, is very rich, and we really appreciate and understand the effort that has gone into those papers. So on the one hand, people might be looking at pre and post application, what changes have been observed in practice, what are the financial impact of the changes. So there are many big picture questions that people can address because there are so many people involved, and there are so many aspects to the impacts. And that's one of the things I take away from today, that the variety of experiences that people have been having. So we're interested in the effects for market participants. When I say, are the objectives of the standards being achieved? So the impact into the marketplace. Incredibly a rich commentary today that I've enjoyed so much. So I've got a few slides coming where I can outline some of the things that we have identified already as issues to do with the 3 standards, 9, 15 and 16. And the type of material coming now in the slides I want to refer to is the sort of things we'll put in the webinar. I've also got at the end of this slide deck many links. So as you're thinking of planning, if you're planning research into the standards and you would like to find some of the background materials, we've also loaded the links into these slides to help you do that. So next slide, please, Kathleen. So just touching on some details in relation to the 3 big standards. I'm not talking about 17 today, so just 9, 15 and 16. So in relation to IFRS 9, this slide just points to some of the changes that were made, and because things changed, then there's related research opportunities. So on this slide, we're talking about the expected credit loss model. Instead of, there's a big change for preparers there, instead of the incurred loss model. In our discussions today, that was referred to as something that has had big impact, that people such as directors have had to get some overall understanding of those type of changes. You know, with IFRS 9 that there is no available for sale category. There is a great deal of research that showed us that that category was used for earnings management purposes. There is no available for sale category now. And we did have reference today when in our various discussions when we were talking about the equity method, and some of the speakers referred to the best way to be accounting for associates and whether using IFRS 9 would be appropriate. And then this whole issue of whether it's fair value profit and loss or fair value OCI was also referred to today. So there are questions around this, that there's been a change in how IFRS 9 treats equity securities. Third point on the slide there is hedging. There are new hedging requirements in IFRS 9, and we're interested in research on those. We haven't begun that part of the PIR yet, and we haven't begun the part on expected credit loss modelling yet, because we'd like there to be more evidence from practice gathered before we begin the PIR. Next slide, please, Kathleen. There's been a lot of talk today about transition. When a new standard is adopted, the process that goes on. In particular, we've heard about GRIEF with IFRS 16. IASB has also heard about GRIEF with IFRS 9. And the standard setters make various requirements for transition, and they also make various requirements for disclosures about transition, because standard setters know that investors and analysts require time series of data, and new standards disrupt the time series. So various requirements are made, and what we're interested in hearing from academics and any researchers about how that investors and users of the information have coped with the disruption to the time series. So from a accounting standard setter side, have the requirements that the standard setters put in place, to what extent have they smoothed that transition process? So basically, to what extent did the accounting standards make the right choice in requiring various pieces of information for transition? Some people have challenged us on this and said, well, why do you want to know about transition? That's historical. The reason we want to know is we want to do it better next time. If we haven't done it well enough this time, we've got to find out, and want to do it next time. IFRS 7 is the standard that requires the disclosure in relation to IFRS 9. And because IFRS 9 was changed, then changes were made to IFRS 7. And one of the things we're working on in IFRS 7, but also in the other new standards, 15 and 16, is more objective-based disclosure requirements. This speaks back to the points I made earlier when Brian referred to Disclosure Initiative and the Disclosure Initiative projects. Part of this is trying to make better use of objectives for disclosure, so what we're calling objective-based disclosure requirements, so that users of the accounting standards know what the objective is. So that's like a high-level statement of what the objectives of the disclosure requirements are, what they're trying to achieve, what sort of information a preparer should provide for the user, and how the user is going to make use of that information. So that approach is in line with the comments that people have made today in the session on understandability, where they've said, we need to understand better what the standard's trying to do and why it's doing it, and a more, I don't want to say conceptual, because it wasn't really that, but it was more about a better understanding of the standard and what the standard is trying to achieve. So disclosure objectives are trying to do that. Now, where academics can help is by looking at where disclosure objectives are used and try to give us feedback on how people are responding to disclosure objectives. With that kind of feedback, we can work out how to push forward on these projects. Many times today, people have recognised that this is a consultative process, that these standards take a long time to develop, and that's because of the consultation loop that goes on, the feedback loop, and the changes that are made, and it's an iterative process. Here, we're seeking feedback on, firstly, these disclosure objectives that are already in place and how people are responding to them, both preparers, investors, auditors, regulators, all of those parties. And if we can get the feedback here, that will help us and feed into our next project, the Disclosure Initiative project. That's the one I referred to earlier as the Targeted Standards Level Review of Disclosures. We're going to consult with you and ask you are we going in the right direction here? Are our proposals to make use of more objectives and less about specific requirements, do you think they're going to be effective? And this is about trying to make the standards more understandable, but they're also about trying to get the disclosures that will be more relevant and less irrelevant information in disclosures, less checklist, less boilerplate. So it's an important area for us, and any information that the academics can provide and give us feedback would be greatly valued. There's a comment in the chat line that says the IFRS should consult the standard users and the people compelled to use the standards, and not only the academics. Yes, David, thank you for the comment. I can assure you that the IASB spends extensive time consulting with the users of the financial statements. The AASB does that directly with its user panel and directly with many outreach into users. I started my presentation today talking about the way that the IASB collects evidence, and there was a whole list there, and academics are only one of them. So there are many people that the IASB consults with. Next slide, please. Right, IFRS 15. So we've heard, some references to IFRS 15 today as part of our discussions. So as for all the standards, we're looking at the type of impact it's had. Because we're international standard setters, we're interested in how industries and countries differ. I've heard comments today already that there can be some industry differences in the application of standards. So that's of interest. In these couple of slides, we're pointing to some things that were specific about IFRS 15, and these are areas that people might choose to have a look at. And one of the major things that came out of the new 5-step revenue recognition model was point-in-time revenue recognition compared to over-time revenue recognition. So the model is a different way of approaching revenue recognition, and participants have recognised that today, talking about the effort that had to go in to understanding that model and applying that model into their operations. So we'd be interested in hearing about the way people have actually changed revenue recognition, because our early feedback tells us that the revenue numbers have not changed significantly. So that's not something to be researched specifically, but what we are interested in knowing is the changes in terms of point in time or over time. Another feature of IFRS 15 is a lot of more guidance than what was in the previous standard, 18. And we've talked today about the extent to which the standard should have illustrative examples and should have implementation guidance, because these are the things that make the standards longer and in some people's view make them more complex. Nevertheless, 15 features a lot of guidance, and that will be in response to the work and the consultation that went on during the development of that standard. So there are many issues within 15 that researchers could have a look at. Next slide, please. Also in 15, the transition question that I discussed under IFRS 9, what sort of choices did people make on transition? We're interested in the extent to which people take the modified retrospective approach. Was it beneficial for them to have a modified retrospective approach? Now, again, to make things a modified retrospective approach adds complexity to a standard. The transition in IFRS 17 is made complex by the different ways that entities can transition. But how did that complexity get there? It got there from feedback, the feedback process where people said, oh, we won't be able to do it like that. We need to do it a different way. We can't do it that way. And that's the standards that are listening to the feedback and making adjustments to accommodate stakeholders. So on the one hand, the complexity comes through consultation and endeavouring to meet needs of diverse stakeholder groups. 15 has a modified retrospective. It would have been simpler to have full retrospective, but that wasn't the requirement. So research that can tell us something about that would be of interest and useful with us. A lot of discussion today has been about disclosures and the usefulness of disclosures and what's good about them, what's bad about them, what's needed, what isn't. So feedback for us on IFRS 15 disclosures, what sort of materials are being provided and where the benefits are. We've had reference today to the previous work of one of the research teams on IFRS 15, their interviews that talked about the application experience, and that's great. That kind of thing really will feed into the PIR and be very helpful. The last point there just makes reference to disclosure objectives and requirements, which is what I was talking about earlier in relation to IFRS 9. Next slide, please. So just quickly concluding now, IFRS 16, it's been great to hear all the comments today, and we do encourage research into this. Big changes. We've just heard how big changes for users of financial statements. We know that preparers have had to do an enormous amount of work on IFRS 16, and it has been impacted by COVID as well, just to make things more complicated. So lots of things that researchers can have a look at, things that they can dig in, and today's session has been very, very useful to highlight things for academics. Next slide, please. Yes, we've touched on these things already, transition and usefulness of disclosures. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, everybody knows the IASB does not work in a vacuum. The IASB needs constant contact, and an event like today is fantastic for bringing people together. We appreciate the efforts of our national standard set of partners, such as the AASB, who do such an excellent job of working with the stakeholders in Australia, and also working with all the other national standard setters and consulting through the various groups that we have, and working on specific things, and being AASB staff being in contact with IFRS staff and board members. Just a fantastic effort from people to make sure that the IASB is well informed on issues. And as we go into the PIRs, I just renew my call for that process to continue, for you to continue to be engaged with giving us the feedback on the implementation and application experience. As we roll out all our consultation documents for 2020, I humbly ask for your feedback. I realise that you have a lot on besides consulting and commenting on the standards, but it's an essential part of the process. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to all the comments that you're going to send us in various ways. These last slides that Kathleen's just bringing up now, there are 3 slides, 9, 15 and 16. Just give you some links that you can have a look at, and the slide decks I know are available for you. So with that, there are no further open questions. So I'll conclude my session, and I need to hand back to Tom. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to talk to you today and indeed attend the forum. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. It's always a pleasure to have your involvement. It sounds like there's some really good opportunities coming out of the IASB, and I agree, it's definitely been quite a busy year for all of us. So to close today's event, I'll now hand over to Professor Noel Hardy from the University of New South Wales to give some final words before handing over to Keith to close the session today.
Thank you very much, Tom, and congratulations to Keith, yourself, and the entire AASB team for putting on such a great event in these rather challenging times. Thank you also to all the presenters and panel members. I personally have found the day to be extremely informative, and I'm sure that I'm not alone in holding that view. As academics, we are motivated in the conduct of our research by many different factors, but foremost of these, in my view at least, should be to positively impact on policy and practice. And it's with that in mind that it was just so great to see the level and depth of discussion around the issues raised in the research that was presented in today's forum, and also really great to hear and discuss the opportunities for academic research to play a role in the standard setting work program. I am conscious that we're getting towards the end of the day, and I won't hold you any longer than is necessary, but I did want to take this opportunity to note that the School of Accounting at UNSW was very pleased to be associated with this year's AASB Research Forum, and we thank the AASB for the opportunity to work with them on this important event. We were in a different time hoping to have welcomed you to our Sydney CBD campus as hosts of this year's event, but for obvious reasons, this turned out not to be possible. It is good to see that things, however, are starting to look very positive for 2021, and UNSW School of Accounting is looking forward to continuing our association with the AASB and welcoming you next year in Sydney to the 2021 AASB Research Forum. So we do hope that we're going to be able to see you in person in Sydney next year. So thank you, and I believe at this point I'm going to pass back to Keith. So thank you, Keith.
Thanks very much for that, Noel, and thanks for those kind comments. Now, in conclusion, just wanted to echo Noel's comments there, thanking all of today's presenters, particularly the 3 research teams. An enormous amount of work went into each of those projects, and I'm sure you all agree with me that they were all excellent and did quite clearly generate a good discussion that will be informing a number of aspects of our work agenda over the next 12 months or so. I'd also like to thank all participants as well for all your questions, which push forward the discussion as well. But I'd particularly like to thank the AASB staff. An enormous amount of work has gone on behind the scenes, and so it's through their efforts that we've had today's event, which, echoing comments that have been made so far, has been a terrific event. Now, Noel mentioned that next year's event is going to be at the UNSW campus, I suppose, barring another pandemic breaking out. So hope that we can look forward to seeing you all there. We're currently in the process of putting together the projects that will be presented for next year's forum, so we can look forward to that. Now, one of the things that I've flagged on a number of occasions, since I took the chair's position of the AASB in May of this year, is much greater engagement with academia compared to days gone by. So we're really looking to ramp this up a fair bit. So I would really encourage everyone who is interested in participating or presenting research for them to consider putting in an expression of interest to the 2022 forum. We're going to be setting out a call for EOIs in the second quarter of next year, that's scheduled for the second quarter of next year. So please keep your eyes open for that. However, I am also actively looking for opportunities to expand our engagement with academia, but I am also have asked for any research that is of relevance to the AASB's work program. Don't necessarily wait for the opportunity for an event like this. Please feel free to bring our attention to it. We're very interested in finding out all the leading thoughts that's going on in academia and how this can relate to us pushing our work agenda further forward. So also, for those of you that are interested in undertaking academic research with AASB support, I'd also encourage you to approach us directly to, so outside necessarily the confines of the research forum, approach us to find out what, whether we might be interested in supporting a particular research project. As I mentioned at the start today, we've recently appointed a research director, Mark Shine, who has been quite active in facilitating the Q&A discussions today. So as a first port of call, we've got Mark there, but I'd also encourage emailing myself, the other senior members of the AASB with interesting research projects or proposals. Further to this push to encourage research and engagement with the academic community, we're setting up a dedicated research page on the AASB website. So there you'll find our research needs, various research reports that we've produced in the past, but just doubling back to encouraging you all to put through proposals to us. Please don't feel necessarily constrained to necessarily just what we've said are our research needs. We're quite open to hearing proposals on areas we might not have necessarily identified. Always open to the possibility that we may not have thought of something that we need to be thinking about. So please don't feel constrained in that respect. Now, the slides and presentations will be up on the AASB website in the next few days, and the presentations will be put up on our YouTube channel. So I encourage you all to go and have a look at those when, once they're up and you have a moment. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank everyone again for their attendance and participation today. And a reminder, we have our networking drinks at 5 o'clock. Which is in about 20 minutes. So take a bit of a breather, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at the networking drinks function. Okay.